Rajani Katta, the author of the MMI book, and in this series of videos, I'm discussing strategies to help you excel on the CASPer exam. And in this particular video, I wanted to talk about what I refer to as reform questions. So I'm going to give you an example of a scenario. And in this scenario, you're called to the nursing station in front of the ICU because your nursing colleagues are dealing with a challenging situation. Basically, there was a patient's granddaughter who arrived at the ICU, but she arrived 1 hour after visiting hours had ended. And she is now very upset because she's been told by the nursing staff that visiting hours are over and she's not going to be able to see her grandfather. So in this type of CASPer scenario, you will be asked 3 different questions following the scenario. The first question might be what I call a situational judgment question. So the first question might be, what would you say to your nursing colleagues in this situation? The second question might be what I call a reform question. So the second question might ask you, how would you prevent this situation from happening in the future? So when I talk about reform questions, these are often questions that are asked they ask you to zoom out. So instead of focusing on the particular individuals in the scenario, you're being asked to zoom out and look at this scenario from a more systemic lens, a policy lens. How would you change things? What would you modify in order to prevent such situations from happening in the future? So that's what we call a reform question. So in order to answer a reform question, I think it's very helpful to break it down into 3 different parts. The first is information. The second is to think about the goals. And the third is to tie it back to that particular scenario. So let me start with information first. And if you just stop for a moment and think about how this would play out in the real world, if you wanted to create a new visitor policy, you wouldn't just get together a meeting of all the department heads and just go ahead and set up a policy and then tell everybody about it. You would instead start talking to all stakeholders. You would talk to the nurses, you would talk to other families, you would talk to the physicians, administrators, the security staff. You would really try to get information from all of the people who might be impacted by a new visitor policy. You also want to think about how you're going to obtain that information. Are you going to send out surveys? Are you going to set up individual meetings to get feedback? Are you going to maybe set up a town hall meeting where everybody could come and give their input? So those are different ways of obtaining that information. And then it's very important to learn from others. Would you perhaps speak to hospital administrators at other hospitals to learn how their visitor policies have been working? And, so all of this is very helpful information. And I want to step back for a moment and make it clear that if you are typing out your response, you only have about 3 to 5 sentences to answer one question. So even though this is a reform question, how would you prevent this situation in the future? And really, I could write 10 pages about the development of a visitor policy to prevent these situations from happening in the future. That's not what the CASPer is looking for. They're not looking for a really full response. What they're looking for is what you can write down, what you can type out rather, in about 90 seconds to answer this question. So I'm really aiming for about 3 to 5 sentences here. Now, if this is a video response, you have 1 minute, and that definitely makes it easier. You're going to be able to touch upon these a little bit more fully. But in this particular example that I'm going to give you here, I'm going to focus on a typed response where you have about that 3 to 5 sentences in order to be able to discuss this. Now, the second part of answering a reform question well really relates back to your goals for this policy. What are your goals when it comes to a visitor policy? As you're thinking about your goals, it's really helpful to actually verbalize that. So in this case, you might say something along the lines of, my goals for this policy are to create one that allows for the highest level of medical care by the nurses and physicians, while also allowing for appropriate hospital security, while at the same time making sure that we are supporting our patients and our family members at a very difficult time. So that's the ultimate goal of this policy. And then one other area that would be very helpful to outline in your response is to tie your response back to the scenario. So was there a particular concern that was brought up in the scenario, and can you tie your response back to that scenario? So in this case, if you have a patient very upset because she did not know about the visitor policy, how can you address that? So you might say something along the lines of, once we developed the visitor policy, I would make sure that that was clearly visible. I would post copies of that at every nursing station. I would post it in the elevator, and I would make sure that it was prominently available on the website. In this scenario, you have a family member who is very upset because she has arrived outside of visiting hours and wasn't aware of the visitor policy. She thinks it's too restrictive. How would you prevent this situation from happening in the future? So in my typed response, I have about 3 sentences. So here's an example of a typed response. I would work to create a policy that helped support patients and their families during a very difficult time, while also allowing for the highest level of medical care and hospital security. I would start by surveying patients, their families, the physicians, the nurses, and the hospital security staff to get their feedback on our proposed policies. Once we had a policy finalized, I would make sure that that policy was prominently posted on all floors, in the elevator, on the hospital website, and that a copy was provided to every patient and visiting family member. So to recap, there are what I consider to be about 5 major types of questions on the CASPer exam. Oftentimes you're going to be starting with a situational judgment question. What are you going to do about this exact situation? And that might be followed by a reform question, meaning how would you prevent this situation from occurring in the future? So you just saw an example of how I would respond to a reform question where I incorporated all 3 aspects of that into a typed response. And just to emphasize this point again, in a typed response, you only have about 90 seconds per question, so you really have to be succinct. It's a little bit different for a video response because you will have 1 minute, and you can provide a fuller response in that situation. So again, if you are interested in more videos to help you prepare for the CASPer exam, please go ahead and check out our website for blog posts and other videos in this series. I'm Dr. Rajani Katta, author of the MMI book, and I want to wish you the best of luck on your CASPer exam.